St. Paul is the capital city of Minnesota, and together with nearby Minneapolis, it forms the Twin Cities region, the 16th largest metropolitan area in the U.S. with a population of nearly 4 million. St. Paul is recognized for its cold weather, architectural marvels, and, according to its official website, for being the most livable city in America. This is a fair argument to make today, but in the early 1900s it was anything but, and nearly all of that can be placed squarely on this one man. In Louisville, Kentucky, 1885, a happy family was started with the birth of John J. O'Connor. No more than a year later, his parents moved themselves to St. Paul, Minnesota, where they ran a boarding house. The newly born O'Connor didn't know it at the time, but one day the entire city would be under his control. In his college years, he attended school for business, but he shortly after left that trade behind for a life of politics. He jumped around quite a bit in the police department, but wherever he went, he was recognized for his diligence and efficiency in managing and prosecuting criminals. He was largely trusted and respected, having been nicknamed the Big Fellow for his position of power in the police force. In the year 1900, he was appointed as Chief of Police for the city of St. Paul. It's hard to say exactly why John J. O'Connor did what he did. Perhaps this new career as police chief caused him to feel as though he was in over his head. Perhaps the immense power and control of financial assets associated with the job corrupted him. Perhaps the John J. O'Connor everyone liked and trusted never really existed deep within him. Regardless of his motives, John J. O'Connor established a policy known as the Layover Agreement. This was an unofficial, never-before-heard-of rule that allowed the criminals and mobsters of America, the very people he swore to protect the city against, to reside within the city under watch of the police. While this change on its own would seem completely senseless, there is more to it than that. There are a few simple rules for those who wish to hide in the shade of the O'Connor tree. The first, and arguably most important, is that criminals were forbidden from committing crimes within the city. Everything beyond the city lines was fair game for nefarious activities, including a certain nearby rival city. The second rule was that criminals must register themselves with the police department upon entering the city. It wasn't a free-for-all in terms of residence, as police would know who was staying where and for how long. The third and final rule was that criminals were obligated to pay a portion of their income to police in the form of bribes. This gave the department a reason to continue with this agreement, and it allowed for a higher level of corruption, which came about in the form of personal connections between gangsters and police officials. While criminals are among the people that'd be least likely to follow rules set in place by police officers, this agreement actually turned out quite well for the city of St. Paul, at least for some time. Criminals benefited greatly from the agreement, and for that reason they essentially policed each other, so that no one would, quote-unquote, ruin a good thing. This held true until 1920, when John J. O'Connor retired from the force for good. While things didn't fall apart immediately, John J. O'Connor's power as an expert criminal manager and prosecutor was suddenly absent from the city. Criminals became more rebellious and, well, criminal within the limits of St. Paul. Thankfully, Prohibition began the same year, which caused many to turn to bootlegging, a comparatively less troubling sin than robbery, extortion, or murder. 2 years later, the Great Depression begins, and due to people's general lack of trust in the government and the financial system, a bank robber was often seen as something of a vigilante or folk hero. It is during these times that gangs such as the Barker Karpus gang rose to prominence. Other notable figures during this time include Pretty Boy Floyd, Frank Mitchell, George Babyface Nelson, John Dillinger, Mary Billy Frechette, Homer Van Meter, Bonnie and Clyde, and Leon Gleckman. In 1933, both Prohibition and the Great Depression end, which makes things much more difficult for criminals. In the next year, criminologist Wally Jamie was hired to expose St. Paul's corruption. The stations and offices were wiretapped. After a year of waiting, Jamie had over 3,000 pages of incriminating evidence against the department, single-spaced, mind you. On top of this, 2,500 conversations amongst police officers and officials were recorded. The investigation concluded in 1935, after which many of those involved faced disciplinary action, be it suspension, termination, fines, or imprisonment. In 1936, the current police chief, Thomas A. Big Tom Brown, was fired, thus finally ending the Layover Agreement after 36 years of corruption. Most of the criminals who were not killed or captured already would be in the following years. Alright, so I'm actually from St. Paul, and I was able to record a number of the locations that had come up during my time researching this topic. This first one here is the Lincoln Court Apartments. This place is famous because notorious bank robber and criminal John Dillinger stayed here for quite some time, and he actually had a famous shootout with the police. After they'd raided his apartment, he evaded capture along with his girlfriend at the time, Mary Frechette, and a friend of his, Homer Van Meter, all of whom were notorious criminals. This is the First National Bank. This spot has really been around quite some time, but it was the location of one of John Dillinger's robberies. Here we have just a very unassuming house that's actually very close to mine in the West St. Paul area. And this house actually was where the Barker Karpus gang lived for a number of years before they also had a shootout with the police, and they were able to escape. They were allegedly notified ahead of time by another police officer, so even though the police began to crack down on them, there were still inside police members who informed them and allowed them to escape. All right, here we have the Ham Brewing Company. William Ham Jr. was an executive of this company, and he actually was kidnapped and held ransom for $100,000 by the Barker Karpus gang. They did secure the money, and he was released, but this was their production facilities, which was headquartered in St. Paul. Their offices were also downtown, and I didn't know that until I just randomly came across them by chance. But this is where their offices were, I later found out with some more research. All right, so this is the Union Depot. This was essentially the first stop that gangsters saw when they came to St. Paul. They would often come by car or train, and so this was sort of a transit hub for that. Here we have the St. Paul Hotel, and this was basically the second stop gangsters came to when they're coming into the city, because this is where there would be a desk set up. Gangsters were here able to sort of register with the police so that they would be protected under the Layover Act, and they also usually paid their bribes here. This was a brothel run by Madame Nina Clifford, and this actually used to be downtown where the library is now, and it was moved. I don't know how they moved it all the way over here, given that it's bricks and mortar, but this was a very famous hangout spot for many criminals. And this is another hangout spot for many of the criminals. This is where you could find many of them, the Green Lantern Saloon. Right here we have the Wabasha Street Caves. These are famous because during Prohibition era, they were used for bootlegging. And it's actually interesting because it kind of harkens back to how St. Paul was founded to begin with. St. Paul, the city, was founded by a bootlegger who lived in a cave. All around St. Paul, they have Peanuts characters because it was the home of Charles Schulz, creator of the Peanuts. And they're always relevant to the place where the figures are placed. So here you can see a pinstripe gangster right in front of the Wabasha Caves. So when I was filming all of this, a couple of people had approached me and just really been curious about what I was doing. Of the people I had talked to, only one of them really knew much at all about the gangster history. And I think it's just interesting how people are just passing these locations every day without really giving them a second glance. It's a broad assumption, but I would assume that most people generally know very little about the details and locations of gangster history, although they may know that gangsters had at one point really ruled the city.